Not clear that we're in a position to properly estimate the value of Heidegger's position, or I should say it's clear, not to say quartz crystal clear, that we aren't in that position. So I'm still explicating the title, The Return of the Stray, in connection to Gnostic interpretation, whereby we would think that the death of God, and therefore Nietzsche, would have to presage the moment when one is able to remove oneself from the alien region into which the Geworfenheit or thrownness has brought us, and then attempt to seek our the region which will unlock our essence, in the same way that the forms of leisure unlock the essence of the human being, on an analogy with the seed being in the right soil. I said falsely that Arendt has called herself a questioner. She hasn't. She's called herself a thinker. So we can see there's three positions now: philosopher, thinker, questioner. The thinker, we can get more orientation through the following example, which will also show us something of the direction towards the region Heidegger wants us to move. And it's also a direction which was discovered to a different purpose in the logical positivist tradition coming out of the, especially because of the influence of Descartes, on the idea of perceptio, or perception, that we have this, and Kant follows this, and Hegel follows this, that there has to be some access of a sense creature to an object through perception. So, in the beginning of Hegel, of course, this sense certainty is all about that. Whereas the region Heidegger wants to move, we can say merely formally correctly, but without actually gaining the slightest sense of what we're talking about, that it's in between the, or interpolated into the space between the sense side of things, which would be the accidental side of things, or the side focused on the moving thing in Plato, and the eyes of the soul, which are focused on the thing that stays the same, or on the object of the conception in Kant or Hegel. So there's a good discussion, a short discussion between A.J. Ayer and Godfrey Leslie on YouTube. I tried to put it into the this feed, and it's about the positions circling around behavioralism as a Cartesian position, on the basis that both the position of subjectivity and the behavioralist condition can be understood, at least to be in some major way determined by, there may be a number of other factors, the reception of Descartes in the Anglosphere, so that there becomes a question, the so-called question of other minds, which is the title of the talk that I'm pointing to, so that one can wonder come to the philosophic zombie issue, whether there's really um, there may be some difference between philosophic zombie and the question of other minds more broadly. A philosophic zombie has this particular notion of consciousness and whether it's there or not, and the problem of other minds is um, more close to the vernacular meaning, but with different sorties out from the vernacular into philosophic um, exactitude. Um, so once we have the problem of wondering whether the person is feeling what we think they're feeling, say, and they have a cold, and then we think they must be miserable, for instance. Then the other side of that becomes the root of a kind of behavioralism, at least in the sense of you look and then you see the runny nose or other outward signs, and then the question comes, um, does it take an inference for you to then say, an inference, a subjective inference, to then say this person must be feeling like this? Um, A.J. Ayer is taking the Cartesian complex side of it, whereas the interesting thing is the Gottfried Leslie position begins with a position which is more like the Heideggerian unity. So what he's saying is the question doesn't really even arise. So I think if you listen to the whole discussion, you see his question, as it so turns out, is very close to at least a position which shows us the basis when thinking out of the analytic tradition to get to point us towards Heidegger's position. So what he's saying is it's simply that when we think of a mind, we're already thinking of ourselves, the human being, in particular. We're thinking of the human being, and he doesn't bother to qualify it historically or anthropologically in the sense of an American human being or an Aztec or something, but he just says, if I ask if the dog has a mind, I'm already making a comparison to myself or to the human being without any particular reference to, maybe he doesn't say this explicitly, but without this, but I suppose it's implicit, without this particular form of behavioralist or externalist observation as contrasted with what we might infer about the actual state of the inner world of the other being, say a dog. And then, so if you begin with this position, this is like what the tradition understands as the first step towards intellection, where we have so-called intuition of an object. So I look, I say, this is a dog. And that's the first, then I have a subject matter to work with, rather than, of course, in Heidegger, we would say this rather than some scientific specialist will come in and talk about the liver or so, and begin with a part as though it were separate. But we must first start with the dog. So Strauss gives here the example of the cow. And so then it's clear that if you're living in a certain, even today, I think, in many parts of India, the sacred cow is still the first thing you're going to encounter when you encounter a cow. So cow already actually means sacred cow, and it's already, this is where you get into the thinking. Once you say, we can't merely begin with the Western notion of a cow and then say, this is what I accidentally ran into with the Japanese thing, right? Like, can we just look at the Hindu civilization, let's call it, and then say, actually, we're starting from the cow, and then you make a little modification and say, but with them, the cow is reverenced or it's sacred, and then you make a little tent of spider webs in the intellect, and you kind of, or a so-called, how did the classicists put that? A notional type, a kind of construal of the how that thing is in the other world, and you would want to get, and then you could sort of make feints towards Jacob Burckhardt, history of the everyday, how does it look, and things like that. But all along, we would have begun with our own world, with the cow, and not with whatever that animal is immediately for the Hindu. And then you could even expand that to say, what do you mean immediately? This would get into these questions like Nietzsche's raising about what does we think we mean by thinking. We've already got this dogmatic interpretation of thinking. The whole thing is already now undermined and brought into a kind of genetic circle where we can slosh around and the tide can come in and out on any of these starting points. So it's somewhere in that region where we would be moving when we were trying to overcome, as questioners too, when we're trying to overcome language, because the language seems to be in some way identical to the total difference of the first step in a world. And then we can see where we're trying to, at least in some vague way, where the region that we're supposed to be in the Gnostic, we throw this Gnostic compass over Heidegger's thought, which doesn't quite belong there maybe, but just for some orientation, then we can see which direction we're pushing towards.